Well, good morning, friends. Obviously, this is not the way that I thought that I would be speaking to you this morning through a screen, but I'm really glad that I can do that. And I'm glad to be with you, if only through this way through a screen. But I want you to know that I'm not here alone. Chris Hickman and Jason Cheek are here helping me. They are standing in for you this morning. They're going to do, the hard job of laughing at all my jokes and giving out all the amens and that stuff. So, they're your representatives. Now, we had intended this morning to be thinking together about our 10th generation vision as a church and sort of looking out on the horizon. And last week I said, if you miss church this Sunday, you might be like the one guy that missed Pentecost. And it turns out that the Lord had different plans, and that's wonderful. We love His plans. We love His interruptions. So I thought this is a great time to sort of drop back and speak into something a need that I see among us. I see it in my own heart. I see it in many of your lives as we've talked together. And I want to do that from 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verses 11 to 13. We have spoken to you freely, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children. Widen your hearts also. In return, widen your hearts also. Now, we began 2020 by calling it a year of hospitality. We had no idea we were going to run into a pandemic. And I'm so glad that we called it a year of hospitality. I can't imagine all the gains we would have forfeited if we hadn't faced into that with a resolve to do and practice biblical hospitality. But if 2020 sort of loosened the glue on our relationships, then 2021 basically disintegrated many relationships. And I know that many of us feel that way. I don't know many people right now who can look back honestly on the last 18 months to 2 years and say that they have been widened in their affections for others. Certainly, I don't know anybody who would say that they've deepened in community. And I know that many of you feel that way because you've told me. And so this sermon is for all of us who desire to deepen in our relationships, to restart in many friendships, to discover friendships, all the intangibles of community together that we deeply desire. This passage is a doorway into that, and it's one among many in the Bible. So I'd like to take it in 2 steps this morning. I want to ask 2 questions from this passage. The first is this: what holds us back? The second is, what opens us up? So one, what holds us back? Look at verse 12. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. Now, the Apostle Paul and company had opened up their heart. Isn't it striking that in verse 11, he doesn't say our hearts, plural. He says our heart. There was such unity among Paul and the Christians that he served with that he could speak for them. He could say, our heart. And as they opened up their heart, the Apostle Paul expected something to happen. And when he didn't see it happening, he thought he could see on the horizon a crisis. And let's notice how radically different that whole way of thinking is from the way that we tend to think when left to ourselves. We tend to think, as one well-known Christian band put it in the 90s, I think, if you can't say nothing good, don't say nothing at all. Now, that does help, for us to live by that maxim. But that's not actually the biblical ethic. The way that Paul thinks about what we do with our mouths and what we do with our time, what we do with our talents and all those things is radically different. Actually, it's not merely the bad that we do that concerns the apostle. It's the good that we withhold, the love that we withhold. Ray Ortland Sr., who is the father, obviously, of my predecessor, of Pastor Ray, he says somewhere that the greatest Christian sin is, in his estimation, withheld love. Withheld love. I believe that deeply. I know loads of people right now who could keep 100% of their troubles. But if added to that could be the expressed love of their allies, their whole world would be different. They could keep 100% of their problems, but if added to that could be the expressed love and affection and affirmation and support and we're with you of their allies in Christ, their whole world would be different. Why? Because how many people are not primarily suffering from the yelling of their enemies, but from the yawning of their allies? Why? Because the love that we withhold is actually a more powerful force than the evil that we endure. The love that we withhold is a more powerful force than the evil that we endure. Therefore, when the Apostle Paul is looking at these Corinthians, he sees a crisis in the making when they don't open their hearts to him as he has opened their heart to them. One of the most striking things to me in reading the works of Francis Grimke, the late 19th and early 20th century pastor and civil rights leader, was there's a continual theme in Grimke that the most discouraging opposition he faced was not the loud voice of prejudice that from so many in the South that he endured, but the silence of their white allies. We can endure a lot when we know that our friends are with us. It's the love that we withhold that's the more powerful force. So I want to ask the question, what holds us back from this expressed love? What's in the way? And I want to get real practical here. And I just want to deal with what's most obvious. There are three massive, obvious things that I want to point out very quickly that are holding many people back from expressed love in this historical moment. The first one is this: the physical world feels less safe than it used to feel. The physical world feels less safe than it used to feel. Now, I'm just going to appeal to you personally because we all have personal experiences of this. I was on a line in a grocery store recently. Many of us could tell stories like this. And the guy behind me kept sort of inching closer to me. And one time he even got within like 5 feet of me. And I was basically offended. And I realized that I am basically navigating reality, sort of assessing the threat level of everybody around me in a public place. Like, what is that? How did that happen? Well, I know I'm not alone. The physical world feels less safe. Physical presence really matters for deepened relationships, and when there's a hesitation, then we're held back. So that's the first thing. The physical world feels less safe. The second thing is this: the relational world feels less safe. I heard recently of some major corporations that were attempting to ban conversations about politics in the workplace. And I don't have to explain to you why they would be thinking that. We all have experienced the inflammatory nature of politics today, so much so that, we don't bring it up oftentimes if we don't have to. I mean, probably you experience something like that around Thanksgiving. And that matters because it holds us back from getting into relationships when we feel like we're sort of walking on eggshells. How does that deepen relationships? So the relational world feels less safe. The third thing is this: there are new rhythms of life that are working against community. There are new rhythms of life working against community. There was a great article on the Gospel Coalition last week from Jeremy Linman about how COVID has affected our friendships. You could find it easily. He points out from a New York Times survey that in quote, in 2020, the average American traded 300 hours of in-person time with friends, church members, and neighbors for 300 hours of social media, TV, and internet reading. 300 hours. He goes on to say, no wonder 2021 turned out this way, and 2022 promises more of the same. And again, this all comes after the U.S. Surgeon General called loneliness our great epidemic in 2017. He concludes by saying, Lord, have mercy. And we echo that prayer. New rhythms of life working against community are a problem because habits are hard to break. And we've got to break some. When the Apostle Paul says to the Corinthians that he speaks to them as to little children, he's speaking to us. I mean, we're all cut out of the same bolt of cloth here. None of us are very good at this. And what holds us back is really very basic. And we're all facing into the same reality. These three forces are restricting our affections in various ways. And now I just want to hit this on the head because someone out there right now is thinking, are you saying that because I practice social distancing that I'm restricted in my affections? And I just want to say, no, that's not what I'm saying. When I don't feel well, I don't get around my grandparents. I practice social distancing, and that's how I love them. So I'm not saying that social distancing means we're not loving. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that all of these factors taken together have the net effect, in most cases, of restricting our expressed love. So we are more withdrawn because of what's happened to us. Probably we're facing into something like generational trauma. You know, every now and again, it probably is helpful if we're wondering, what is happening to me? To stop and consider that 800,000 people have died in the last year and a half, and that you're living through one of the worst pandemics in human history. So, we're knocked off balance, and understandably so, but we're not stuck here. And I also want to acknowledge how many of you have worked doubly hard to make connections. One of the great things about this pandemic is that several of you have made it your mission in life to keep me encouraged via email. Thank you for your lengthy, encouraging emails. Please don't stop writing them. Don't ever stop writing them. That's wonderful. I'm so grateful. So that's what holds us back. Now, it's kind of obvious, it's kind of out there. But what opens us up? Because that's not as obvious. What opens us up? Look at verse 13. In return, I speak as to children. Widen your hearts also. Widen your hearts also. I love that. The church historian, Dr. David Calhoun of Covenant Seminary, he describes in his lectures on ancient church history how it was that the gospel spread across the Roman Empire and beyond in less than a century. And he describes it this way. He says, the gospel was carried by merchants along the trade routes and by soldiers from post to post, as these Christians went throughout the empire and also into the east, one loving heart setting another on fire. One loving heart setting another on fire. That explains what's happening in our text. Love begets love. Openness begets openness. Honesty begets honesty. In return, Paul says, you notice that, in return. What does that mean? It means that the Apostle Paul expects a return, something to be returned to him when he opens up his heart, namely their open heart, not money or anything like that. He says in verse 11 that he spoke to them freely. What he expected to happen was reciprocation. Now, I love that because of the responsibility of it, because of the leadership that Paul shows here. Paul doesn't say, if you'll open up to me, then I'll open up to you. He says, our heart is already wide open. Come and join us. And that's the way that things actually change. That's the way that leaders think. It's the way that Christians think. The breakthrough that we want to see in deep in community is going to happen when we resolve on the inside to widen our hearts, go there and invite others to join us. That's how it happens. We got to go there. Here's some examples. There's a billion ways to do this, but here's just some that just rolled off the top of my head. For my whole childhood, and even later than that, my grandmother would host a Sunday lunch. And a lot of times it'd be stuff that she, started the night before. We're not talking like a, 10-course meal here. But it was always there. There was always a lot of food. It didn't cost anything, and you could bring anybody. So I never had to wonder on a Sunday after church, is lunch available, or is there a place I can invite people to go? It was just always there. I mean, it was like manna from heaven. I don't even know where it came from. She did this every single week. Looking back now, I realize it was costly. It was consistent. And it made the difference of family, not just for me, but for others that the Lord brought into our orbit. That's a widened heart in action. Here's another example. John and Melinda Perry. If you've been around Immanuel, you might have met John and Melinda Perry. They're some of the founding members of Immanuel. And over the last few years, I've watched as they have pulled others into their orbit and loved them well, using everything from their time to their trade to their possessions. And as a result of that, Immanuel feels like home to more people than it would otherwise. That's a widened heart, the widened heart of Christ, welcoming others in. Here's another example. Jen Ross. You don't have to be around Immanuel long to meet Jen. She's a gatherer. She meets via Zoom on Thursday from 12 to 12:45 and on Sunday from 7:30 to 8 for prayer with whoever wants to join her. She and others are persevering in prayer. And that's an example of how a widened heart makes a way to get together when it looks like there's not any way. I mean, Zoom. And who doesn't want to be a part of that? Who doesn't want to be a part of the kind of community that it's hard to slip through? That's a beautiful world. We all want that. But here's the thing. All of that open-heartedness has a source. If you follow the thread of the open-heartedness in Paul and in those who were with Paul, it will lead eventually back to Jesus, the wide-hearted and the widener of hearts. If you follow the thread of my grandmother's non-wavering and costly hospitality, it will lead back to Jesus, the hospitable, who opens up the very doors of heaven to sinners at the cost of his own life. If you trace the thread of sheltering love that John and Melinda Perry show to those around them, you will find a sheltering Savior on the other end. His heart, his hospitality, his patience, his power at work within us. The deepened relational world that we desire is the world he creates through us. You are the conduit, the pipe, the avenue, the lane, the river, the means of grace of the love of God into someone else's life. You are the relational glue, which means that if we can channel his love, we can all live this way. The reason that Paul can tell the Corinthians to widen their hearts, isn't that striking? I mean, it's a command. Widen your hearts. The reason he can say it with such forcefulness is because he knows that the power of Christ is already moving in that direction. Jesus is already saying yes to that desire. And we want to say yes to that desire as well. It matters so much that we do. Because the real barrier that we're facing always is not all the things that are over and against us, the loneliness and the anger and the poverty and the trials and the persecutions and the betrayals and the divisions. All of those, they'll seem half as heavy, and many of them will be swept away entirely if only the rivers of living water that Jesus is ready to pour through us were to be unleashed. Withheld love is the greatest danger we face. So let's widen our hearts. Let's start today. Love you, family. Can't wait to see you next week.